The Philadelphia 76ers have a lot to address this offseason, and perhaps one of the more confusing futures is Paul Reed. Now, we know all about the Sixers big man. We know all about the struggles to find a productive Sixers big man. That throughout the Joel Embiid era, this organization has cycled through the DeAndre Jordans, the Andre Drummonds, the Amir Johnsons, the Greg Monroes, the Boban Marjanovic. We have tried just about everyone as a backup center, and Paul Reed has been the best of the bunch. But coming this playoffs, it's fair to be a little nervous about the way things played out. That there is a little more uncertainty about, is this guy the long-term backup center for Joel Embiid? And I do believe that those are conversations and questions that Daryl Morey is currently looking head on. Now, to talk about the specifics for why this is on the table, that we know that Paul Reed did sign a contract just last offseason, and to dive into the specifics there, that it was a 3-year deal worth $23.5 million. However, the final 2 seasons were not guaranteed unless the Sixers made it past the first round. So as things are currently constructed, he has a $7.7 million non-guaranteed deal for this year and an $8.1 million non-guaranteed deal for this year. And to just lay into the details of how that happened here, that Reed signed an offer sheet on Saturday morning with the Utah Jazz, and the Sixers waited until 90 minutes prior to the 11:59 p.m. Eastern deadline to inform the Utah Jazz that they matched the sheet. Paul has veto power on any trade and can't be moved to Utah for a full year. One of the terms of the offer sheet provided had a unique twist on Reed's contract. The first season of the contract is fully guaranteed, but the next 2 seasons, worth $15.7 million, become guaranteed if the Sixers advance to the Eastern Conference semifinals, sources said. Given where the two franchises stand, it was more likely the Sixers would have to guarantee these 24-25 and 25-26 seasons than the Jazz. So a little unique twist there, and by the way, it's hilarious that Paul Reed had a no-trade clause throughout the entirety of this year, but a little bit of a chess move by the Jazz to try not to get the Sixers to sign it. That essentially, they had got him for a 1-year deal. They knew that they had no chance of making it to the second round of the playoffs, and ultimately wanted to put the ball in the Sixers' court. That do you actually believe in this guy that you're willing to commit to 3 years versus the 1-year deal that we're essentially handing him? And now, the bit of a surprise is the Sixers did not make it past the first round of the playoffs, and now those years are not guaranteed. And where this becomes a little bit of skepticism is, what is the best route for these Sixers from here? Now, if you believe in Paul Reed, I don't think that is the worst price point in the world. I think those conversations are a little overblown, and I think that's pretty fair market value for Paul Reed. But you also got to be fair and honest and assess that his stock price was certainly higher last offseason than it is this offseason. And when you think about Daryl Morey and what Daryl Morey does best, it is not the human side of things, that it is the analytics side and what is best for the franchise. And I could see Daryl Morey looking to make more of the financially sound decision to cut ties, get that money off the books, and then look to bring in either another center or Paul Reed at a cheaper price. And Bobby Marks of ESPN dives into that a little bit here, saying that Reed has a $7.7 million non-guaranteed contract. The contract would have been guaranteed if the Sixers reached the second round. If Philadelphia waived their non-guaranteed contracts and traded the first, the max room they could create is $64.9 million, which is above the current $55 million right now. Now, those numbers are fairly fluent. There's a lot of moving parts to it, and I do think it gets misconstrued sometimes that more cap space is always better, that if you're cutting good players to get more cap space, you're still kind of shooting yourself in the foot. And you can look towards Isaiah Joe as evidence on this, who, by the way, just started a game on the number 1 seed Oklahoma City Thunder in the Western Conference playoffs, and the Sixers let him walk for free out of fear of dipping higher into the tax and into the salary cap there. Now, but to bring it back to Paul Reed, the conversation here should really be, do you believe that he is the long-term backup center for this team? And to dive into his stats this year, I don't think it's as bad as people are making it out to be. That on the season, he played all 82 games, which is impressive there. Played 19.4 minutes per game, 7.3 points, had 6.0 rebounds, 1.3 assists, 1.0 block, 0.8 steals. Also expanded his game a little bit onto the perimeter this year. Shot 54% from the field and 36.8% from 3. Just 0.7 attempts per game, but it did feel like there was some growing confidence in Paul to shoot from the perimeter. That is an area of game that he looks to be dipping more into, expanding more into, and something that I am curious to see how he builds on it. Now, the fair criticism here is I think there was a lot of buzz coming into the season about how Nick Nurse would use Paul Reed. That when you think back to the success stories of Nick Nurse, look at the Pascal Siakams of the world, the Chris Bouchers of the world, that Paul Reed felt like the archetype of player that Nurse has done an excellent job maximizing. And we did not really see that throughout the season. And it also became the second consecutive head coach that kept Paul on a pretty strict leash. That even during the period of time in which Joel Embiid was out with his meniscus tear, which he missed that 2-month period, that for the most part, Nick Nurse played Mo Bamba as the starter, and then Paul Reed was the guy off the bench. Now, I get the logic behind that he wanted to keep him in his role, keep him comfortable, keep him in the same flow that would be the case as this team approached its playoff rotation. But the reality is, if he believed that there was more of Paul Reed to show on the floor, Nick Nurse would have given him the opportunity to do so. And I also think that there's a little bit of a point to be made that under Doc Rivers, Paul Reed was so scared to get pulled off the court at any moment because it was happening at bizarre times that he played such within his box that it was, I'm just doing the basic basketball skills, that I will set screens, I will roll, I will defend hard, rebound hard, and that's it. With Nick Nurse, it felt like he got a little freedom to start the year, and some of the bad Paul Reed showed face, that he was willing to dribble, put the ball on the floor, and create. Now, again, I don't want this to be an anti-Paul Reed video, that I do think I, for the most part, side with the things of wanting to bring Paul Reed back. But the reality is that Daryl Morey is going to look at this with numbers and not with personalities. And the other thing to bring up in these types of conversation is having a non-guaranteed contract is a huge asset in the trade game. That was Daryl Morey looks to flip these whatever he's trying to build this big tier package for. That this is near $8 million that Daryl Morey can trade that allows a team to release Paul Reed, and then that's $8 million off the books right there. It's a little bit one of those cap tricks, and there's a little more intricacies than just that, but that is the basic idea of it, that you can trade the non-guaranteed contract, have that $8 million value hanging over someone's head, which of course can help and aid the deal to go through, as you do need to match salaries and follow the rules of the CBA, and then that team could release Paul Reed for a little bit of freedom there. So that is something to note, and something that I do think Daryl Morey will keep in his back pocket before ultimately making a decision here. And to talk about Paul specifically, I do think Paul is well aware that he underwhelmed a little bit this season. And to dive into a little bit of what he said following the year, I do think he had an interesting quote here. And this written from Kai Carlin of Sixers Wire here. He first writes that Philadelphia 76ers big man Paul Reed finished a forgettable playoff series against the New York Knicks. He averaged 1.5 points and 2.7 rebounds off the bench. He was unable to make an impact against New York's bigs, and Coach Nick Nurse was unable to play him in the second half of some games. It put a sour ending on what was an overall productive season. He averaged 3.7 points and 6.0 rebounds while shooting 54% from the floor and 36.8% from deep as he began to expand his range. Reed took some big steps forward, but knows there is work to be done. Quote, I feel like I grew a lot from the season before, but I feel like I could have grown more, and I got to do a lot more growing. For real. For me to ever win, a somber Reed told Sixers Wire after the Game 6 loss. You feel me? I feel like I got to grow a lot more for me to help the team and get over the hump and get to the finals. So I do love him looking himself in the mirror, approaching this question with this type of honesty, and it is all fair game there. So we will see how things shake out, but I do love that mentality from Paul. And just to put a little bow on where Daryl Morey's wandering eyes could be looking, take a peek at the center market. They're looking at guys that are available this year. Jonas Valanciunas was a guy that these Sixers showed interest in at the trade deadline. Obviously a higher price point than Paul Reed, but he's the overall better player, and there is reason for that. And then other names, the Rashawn Holmes, James Wiseman, who I do not like, Nick Claxton, who I do like, Isaiah Hartenstein, who's been excellent this playoff run, Moritz Wagner, Daniel Tice, Mason Plumlee, Kevin Love, Andre Drummond. Looking at Andre Drummond specifically there, that is a guy that plenty of people like, making just $3.2 million this year. So that is more than half of Paul Reed's contract for a guy that you can debate is the better player. So when we have these conversations, I think a lot of what the backup center just outlook has changed for the Sixers. That for years I have been very pro Paul Reed for the reason that I think that the Sixers' tactic to having an adequate Joel Embiid backup is to not have a guy like Joel Embiid. That when most teams have a backup center, they are a dime a dozen. That it does not impact the game to that much of an extent. When you look at the Sixers, their most important and best player on both sides of the floor is a big man. It is Joel Embiid at the center position. So when he steps off the floor, those are massive shoes to fill. And everyone is going to look like a step down to the guy who quite literally was crowned MVP of the league last year. But what you have to think about is having different ways to play. That is why I've been pro Paul Reed, is because when you switch him, you can switch schemes, you can switch styles of play, and still find ways to be effective. That he is capable of getting out in the fast break, running and gunning, catching lobs, that he can switch 1 through 5 on the defensive end, that he can play full-out switch coverage rather than the traditional drop coverage that they tend to play in pick and roll with Joel Embiid. Those are all things that I think are an asset, but obviously not a fit for every situation. So what I think the Sixers should do is that you do bring in some competition for Paul Reed. You do potentially bring Andre Drummond back. But I think I would still bring Paul Reed back. That I think that is still fair value. that is a contract that you can hold on moving forward, potentially flip when you're looking to stack contracts and make deals as we get closer to the deadline. That one of the issues these Sixers have had is keeping these tradable contracts around. And I do think they're looking down the barrel of the same issue, more specifically if they do hand Paul Reed this massive contract. Paul George this massive contract. When you think about how much of that salary cap will be tied to the three biggest stars in Joel Embiid, Tyrese Maxey, and Paul George, it leaves little room for the contracts below that. That's how you make a Buddy Hield trade, or find a PJ Washington who has impacted the Mavericks playoff run a ton and is a guy that they got at the trade deadline. You have to have these lower level contracts that are capable of being flipped and able to make deals happen. So I would keep Paul Reed for a lot of these reasons. I do still think he can impact winning on the Sixers team, and I do think that there will be nights that are the Paul Reed nights where you feel his presence, feel his impact, and I don't think that they should pass up on him because of that. Seems like a good locker room guy, seems like a guy that people like to be around, and I do think all that matters in the context of building a constructive team. But I do want to hear from you guys, so let me know in the comments, will Paul Reed be back next year? Do you want Paul Reed back next year? And anything else that you do have on your mind. So appreciate each and every one of you for tuning in and listening. Make sure you are smashing that subscribe button to keep the Sixers Digest family growing. Dropping a like on these videos and commenting your thoughts below. And we'll be back with you next time right here on Sixers Digest.